Welcome to week 7, and we're going to start taking a little bit of a turn here in the course to some other kinds of topics and issues. For this week, as well as next week, we're focusing on lessons based on the question of leadership. During a crisis situation, there are a lot of different approaches you can take to evaluating or assessing a crisis situation, and this next few weeks, we're going to kind of take a leadership perspective. This could be useful to some of you when you look at your paper topics and issues you want to look at and discover. One easy, well, not so much easy, but effective way to study a crisis and its outcomes is to look at who's in charge. And in some cases, there are many people and many voices in a crisis, but sometimes the CEO or president or leader of an organization becomes sort of the public face in response to that crisis. It could be the President of the United States and how they respond to something like a school shooting we've had this week here in February of 2017, or it could be the CEO of the company who's in charge of explaining the company's policies and actions. Your textbook likes to use Mary Barra of General Motors quite a bit in their discussion over multiple chapters. She has emerged as a very effective CEO and leader of that company as they have responded to the crisis concerning ignition switches. You might remember your earlier reading with Aaron Feuerstein concerning Malden Mills. So sometimes you could easily write an entire paper or project that's solely looking at the effectiveness and leadership style of a person that responds to a crisis and how effective they are at leading their organization and responding to public interests. So this week we're going to look at some of the basic lessons that your authors have identified as a sort of good criteria to use in evaluating a crisis. And so these criteria you could easily use as a framework for evaluating the leader of an organization in a paper you would write. And these kind of criteria will also be helpful then in Chapter 8 when we look at some specific crises. In particular, we're going to look at Hurricane Katrina and another report by Frontline that talks about how that was handled. And we will also view a couple brief YouTube videos of leaders responding to crises and exploring how they meet some of these requirements and how they establish themselves as effective leaders. So as we look at the question of effective leadership, there are many kinds of leaders that we need sometimes during a crisis. Leaders have to play multiple roles, and it's interesting to look at the kind of representatives they play. They are important in almost any context to deal with a potential crisis. Some people would say that a crisis is, in many respects, the opportunity to test the leadership of an organization, and some leaders come through a crisis very well respected, and people's estimation of their capacity or abilities as a leader, once tested by a crisis, will often improve. Some used to say that President Lincoln, for example, was a great president, in part because we had a civil war, that without it, he might not have risen to the same level because he had to respond to such a serious situation. His successful responses to that crisis, in this case a war, led to people's estimation of his importance and quality as a leader. So sometimes individuals' lives are defined by how well they respond to the crises in their lives. And so, for example, the mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, when he responded to the 9/11 attacks, certainly improved his public standing and estimation of his leadership quality. So a crisis is often the opportunity for leaders to demonstrate their abilities, to hone their skills, to actually establish their popularity. And so we sometimes see leaders evolving out of crisis or coming out of a crisis actually better off as leaders or as public figures than if they hadn't had that crisis at all. So a leadership perspective is very valuable, and we can learn a lot from it. So your textbook uses a variety of lessons, and I'm going to kind of try and just talk about them quickly and discover a few things that I think are important about them. In lesson 2, they talk about visibility. In today's world, you cannot avoid the press. You can't avoid television. People are going to ask the leadership of an organization very quickly to respond to a situation. So, for example, I teach public relations, and I teach people about, being the PR spokesperson and representing the company. But when a real crisis occurs, people don't want to hear from a spokesperson. They want to hear it from the president themselves, the CEO, the chair. And so it is really important that leaders are visibly available to the press. And those leaders then play a variety of roles in how they respond or what people's expectations are for responses. The media needs quotes, they need comments, they need to hear from the leader, and so media access becomes important. One technique a lot of companies have started using is publicizing or also creating their own YouTube videos featuring their leadership, sometimes in a case of an apology, for example. In order to get their message out to everyone, they will tape record an apology. If you were go to YouTube and type in, like an apology or a corporate apology, you would find things like the Domino's food tampering case. There's a great apology there, or JetBlue, which was an airline that ran into a crisis of service, and their CEO's taped apology statement. There are a number of them online, and so being available to the media and visible is important. In some cases, the role of the president or the leader of an organization is to respond to needs of victims, to comfort them, to respond to their needs and questions. And so it's really important that the leaders show their face, that they show they're in control of the situation, and it shows that they're informed and prepared. Our expectations, I think, have increased about leadership, especially since 9/11. And so, as someone who teaches PR, I would tell my students from a media relations perspective, if your organization's in trouble, you've got to get the CEO in front of a camera. Ideally, you might need to teach them a few things about answering questions and talking to a camera and talking in a microphone. But it's very important for your leadership to be visible and accessible to people. And that plays a big role in determining whether people trust or value the leadership of your organization. The Malden Mills example you read about earlier in this course helps to promote this point about pre-crisis reputation. There's a lot to be said for the need for organizations to create sort of a backlog of reputation prior to a crisis. The first time the president talks to the media should not be in a crisis situation. You should be able to think about, your textbook also uses, I mentioned the Iacocca, who is in charge of Chrysler, and the Tylenol situation is mentioned various places in your textbook. Mary Barra obviously is now, but a lot of her work was after the crisis. But anything you can do to make yourself available to the media and establish an early media presence is important. And so there's a whole area in public relations I teach called corporate social responsibility, that if your organization can show your connection to and commitment to your community, when a crisis happens, that earlier commitment helps you as an organization and protects your popularity. So it is really valuable that leaders develop and think about a crisis before it even happens and start establishing a positive association between yourself and the public without a crisis. You can't build it when it's happening. The lesson 4 about being open and honest following a crisis, sometimes it's hard for some people to be vulnerable, but the leader of an organization is also a parent. They're also have friends and connections to a crisis. They have their own home. They have their own families to deal with. It is important sort of sometimes for the humanity of a leader to show through. And so I think, it is hard sometimes for people to show emotion, but if you look at some of the recent crises, school shootings or the Vegas shootings and other cases, leaders also are people, and they show their personal side more frequently than they used to. And I think that helps to comfort their audiences and stakeholders. It shows your compassion. It also is important to be honest. I mean, people want to know that you're in control, that you have a sense of, as a leader, of control over the situation, but they don't want to see you too cold. And so even to admit that you don't know something can be helpful. In Lesson 5, there's this idea of creating opportunity. We've talked about renewal before. Successful leadership then leads to successful resolution of a crisis. And like I've mentioned, either leaders evolve and grow and respond to a crisis and enhance their leadership value, or it is diminished and they lose their jobs. But there's a lot to be said, and this chapter reinforces that nature, that this is the opportunity, the moment that you can transform your organization. So much more can get done for your company during a crisis and after than without it. And so this is when you strike and change your mission and rebuild your organization and use a crisis in some respects to create the opportunities that would not have arisen as quickly and efficiently as it hadn't. So the positives of a crisis and the role that a leadership can play in it is really critical. And so the opportunity value for a crisis is really important for the leader, and that's part of our lesson of renewal that will again be seen reinforced throughout the textbook. Partnerships are really important. You've got to accept responsibility for your crisis, and you have to be able to avoid sort of this problem of denial and lack of responsibility. You know, there are a number of crises that have happened to organizations where the leadership takes responsibility even though they might not be directly at fault. You know, a terrorist attack is not something you can be held accountable for, but you can still apologize for the pain and suffering your victims, the victims connected to your organization, have faced. Rather than deny or place blame elsewhere, taking some responsibility or at least showing that compassion about a crisis can be very important. People don't want cover-ups. They don't want to feel as though you're lying. And so find points of consensus, create partnerships. In a lot of cases, when you see a major crisis to an organization, you're going to see a press conference that has got the front room full of people, law enforcement, emergency responders, leadership of the organization, government officials. Everyone is going to pitch in and play a role in responding to the crisis, to the press and to the public. Those connections that you have made and those relationships that hopefully you've forged in advance, all those people are going to help an organization to get back on track. And so if you create consensus and connections ahead of time, they will come back and help you when the crisis occurs. There's a lot of good information that says any denial or cover-up is going to be a problem. Crises, they're going to find out eventually. And so, you know, organizations, denial is rarely an effective technique, because denial is going to lead at some point to admission of some kind of guilt, and that flip-flop is very dangerous. You might diminish the value of a crisis to the extent and have it grow and then acknowledge that it was bigger than you expected it to be. But to outright deny or hide from a crisis and then have to change your position is really challenging. So it is really important that your organization think truthfully about what they say, because it'll come out. People just can't hide information like they used to be able to. In Chapter 8, there's also a description of different leadership styles, a whole list of them. I'm not going to go through them here. But the key point to this is that there are different approaches to leadership that some people take. Some are more effective than others in terms of a crisis. Sometimes the style that a leader has is going to change or evolve because of a crisis. You have to determine what kind of leadership people are looking for. Do they want someone who's, firmly in control and who's managing it and kind of owns the crisis? Do they want someone who's more compassionate? Leaders evolve, and that's why one of the reasons why sometimes the leadership of an organization changes very rapidly during or just after a crisis, because the kind of leader the organization needs changes depending on where in the crisis process they are. And so recognizing that as well becomes very important. Remember that we have talked about uncertainty before, that a lot of people don't know what to think about an organization. And so, again, the role of the CEO tends to be oftentimes focused on dealing with those challenges and those situations. So, thinking about what you should say and how you should say it becomes pretty critical. I have listed on this slide here some suggestions for media relations. I think that is the wrong page number. I'm looking it up right now. It's 121. Sorry about that. I'll change it on the actual slide deck. One of the jobs that we often have as communicators in crisis is to train people to respond, and there's some good advice there. So thinking about that overall can be very important. Finally, after a crisis is over, you need to learn to deal with the crisis afterwards. There's a whole area of research in organizational communication we call organizational learning. It's mentioned in your textbook. CEOs and leaders of organizations need to then take responsibility for changing either the culture or the processes or procedures or the approach the organization takes to a crisis, so the next time around they don't make the same mistake. One of the expectations the audience is going to have is that even if you've made a mistake, that you're going to correct those problems and you're not going to let it happen again. People become terribly disappointed and angry when an organization repeats its mistakes. So one of your goals is to learn from that experience and not repeat that experience. This week's lectures are primarily just looking at some of the lessons we have learned. You can apply these, as I mentioned, as sort of a framework, as sort of a set of criteria you could use to evaluate some other leader and how they responded to a crisis. It's not uncommon for you to be able to find YouTube videos and other sorts of statements, recordings, speeches by leaders of organizations who are confronting a crisis, and you can use those statements to evaluate how effective they are, especially by using these criteria. Next week, when we look at the next chapter, we're going to look at, in particular, Hurricane Katrina, which is held out as a good example of failed leadership during a crisis, and you'll be asked questions about it. And I think by looking at these lessons and thinking about how a large, complicated, difficult situation and crisis can either be managed well or poorly, and the public's response is therefore going to be intense if it's good or bad, and you need to be prepared for it. So next week we'll actually have some video to watch. You'll need to make time for that. This week, think about what does it take to be a good leader, and also ask yourself, would a leadership approach to perhaps the crisis you are studying be a productive way to do so? And if so, you now have the opportunity to start looking at how you want to structure your paper or how you want to understand the crisis that you are studying. See you next week.